Thank you very much, Josh. First of all, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today and for your interest to hear about what's going on in Vietnam. Very briefly, today I'm going to try to give you a high-level overview of some of the trends and some of the drivers that are bringing Vietnamese economy to the front pages of international media. I'm not going to go in deep into sectors or a specific business practice. I will try to give some examples and move away from high-level macroeconomic data, but we have a little bit of those also. I'm going to try to make this shorter than the webinar I gave this morning that ended up being a little bit long. So to start with, I would like to put things in perspective and giving you some introduction about Tractus, something that Josh didn't do. We're a consulting company. We've been in Asia for the last 20 years. We started as a site selection practice, and over the years we have expanded our scope of business into everything that our clients has been demanding us. Initially, we were helping companies to set up in Southeast Asia. That was like 20 years ago, and over the years we have expanded our geographical reach and our scope to North Asia, specifically China, in the second wave of foreign investment into Asia, and now we're shifting back to Southeast Asia again, where companies are starting to move away from China and look again into opportunities in the newcomers in Southeast Asia, and that's including Vietnam. We have, as you can see there, 8 offices, and in Vietnam we've been since 2007. To put things a little bit in perspective with regards to Canada and Vietnam, basically Vietnam is a 90 million country. That's 2.5 times the population size of Canada, while the area of the country is around half the size of Alberta. And for all you Canadian people, that will give you some idea on how big the country is, or how small probably. Economy of Canada is 8 times the size of the Vietnamese economy, but when we look at the per capita income, Canada is in the 50,000, while Vietnam is in around 2,000 US dollars. So that's like a 25 times difference, which is telling us that the distribution of the rent and the income is very different, and there is a lot of room for growth in Vietnam, not only in terms of the size of the economy for the country as a whole, but also in terms of the potential growth for the people as potential clients. One of the most significant and remarkable achievements of Vietnamese economy is that in the last 10 years, the economy has tripled its size, and I have to say there are very few countries in the world that has achieved this kind of growth and bringing a huge percentage of the population out of poverty into what they call a middle class. Big drivers for this development has been foreign investment, especially foreign investment into manufacturing for export. Initially, it started as pretty much low-cost manufacturing, companies trying to take advantage of abundance of labor and cheap cost. That's still going on. Vietnam is still one of the most competitive countries in Asia for manufacturing, far cheaper than China, more cost efficient than Thailand, and definitely cheaper than Indonesia or Malaysia. But low cost is not the only driver anymore, and now companies are starting also to invest also to supply the local market, and we'll go into that a little bit later. Canada and Vietnam have a long history of relationships. Canada, despite being one of United States allies during the war, was one of the first countries that established diplomatic relations with Vietnam. But I have to say that the real milestones in this timeline that you see on my screen are 2007. That's when Vietnam joined WTO as a full member. Basically, the implication for that for Canadian companies, not only for for companies all around the world, was that Vietnam opened a number of sectors to the participation of foreign companies. They start a tariff reduction scheme, and they basically improve the business conditions, and that was really the kickoff time for Vietnam coming into the world trade arena. The other big milestone that I would put in there is the TPP, which actually I didn't put it in there because it has been cancelled recently in the last month. So TPP has been really the big driver for changes in the Vietnamese business environment. I didn't put it in there, but it's still a very valid and important driver for change and for future economic relations with Canadian companies. Basically, the position of the Vietnamese government is that despite the fact that it doesn't seem that it's going to be a sign and it's not going to be into effect, the approach is that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, has been and is taking pretty much as the roadmap for Vietnam to transform their legislation and the business environment, and that's something that with or without the treaty is going to continue. That's pretty much the position of the Vietnamese government. Vietnam is engaged into several trade agreements. Some of them in a negotiation stage. Others, like the Vietnam European Union trade agreement, are already finalized and will come into place. So the economic integration process is not going to stop, and TPP is still a valid framework to understand how Vietnam is going to be changing. Having said that, how Canada is going to take advantage of that is still a little bit unclear, because the participation of countries like Canada or Mexico were more like a defensive strategies, being the United States part of it. Now, without the United States, to be honest, I'm not really sure how Canada is going to take advantage of it, but what I'm saying is that the economic integration process in Vietnam is going to continue, so there should be opportunities for Canadian companies. And TPP is not just about it's not about tariff reduction. It's about opening new sectors to foreign participation. It's about making the playing field more equal for all the companies, removing advantage for state-owned companies and making it a more competitive place to do business, improving intellectual property protection, and all these things are measures that are positive for any company, no matter where they come from. In terms of what Canadian companies are doing in Vietnam, to be honest, not much. There are some big names. You can see some of them you might be familiar with that I put in there. There is no big investment, and trade between Vietnam and Canada has reached its all-time peak at something like 3.7 billion. And how this is distributed, as you can see in that slide, seems like the Vietnamese are the ones who are taking most advantage of it, which actually is true. I think the takeaway and what I want to say in this slide is that there is a lot of room for Canada to improve their business and economic relations with Vietnam. As you can see, the growth of Canadian exports is pretty low, and I say pretty low because I'm comparing it with your neighbors, the United States, which is growing by like 11%, and with another country which have a similar export profile to Canada, like Australia, with a lot of commodities and resource-based economy, which again is much more active than Canada in Vietnam, and they're growing their exports by something like 10–11%, also similar. So if these countries are achieving this kind of growth, I think Canada have a lot of room to improve and to catch up. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, Vietnam still have the upper hand in terms of exporting, and basically is because of the type of products that they are exporting. What Canada exports to Vietnam basically is seafood, cereals, and furs, and the drivers for this kind of the demand for these products are kind of different. cereals and seafood is basically driven by the increase in disposable income and an increasing demand for high quality food products that the Vietnamese in the past would not be able to afford or were not aware of the qualities. Now that's changing, so the demand is increasing, and as the Vietnamese rent increase, that's going to keep on going on. The foreskins, that's more related to the Vietnamese garment industry. Vietnam is one of the biggest garment exporters in the world. So basically, the issue they have is they export a lot of garments, but they don't have a supply chain in place, so they have to import all the inputs. And that's part of what they're buying from Canada. What Vietnam exports to Canada basically is garments, and what you see there as electrical machinery and equipment, that's pretty much mobile phones, smartphones, most of them manufactured by Samsung in the north of Vietnam. Very briefly, I'm going to touch upon 4 sectors. We didn't come up with these sectors, and it doesn't mean that these are the only sectors where there are opportunities to do business in Vietnam. We just chose this because these are the ones that has been identified by the Canadian Trade Commissioner in Vietnam. So I'm sure that they have done their own research, and they know these are the best matches for Canadian companies. So IT, I think I don't want to talk about IT. I think I'd rather talk about digital economy, and that includes pretty much everything from hardware, e-commerce, supporting infrastructure, telecom, networks, anything related to e-business, anything related to e-commerce. The drivers for these are, I didn't say before, but Vietnam, 90 million people, 50% are below 30 years old, so it's a very young population. They're very tech savvy. There are 35 million smartphone users. That's pretty much the same as all the Canadian population. And Vietnam has gone from pretty much having nothing in terms of development or services to jumping to the most updated technologies. And Vietnamese are very eager to take on these technologies. Some examples of something that are going on nowadays are, for example, fintech. There are several fintech companies setting up a small business, from digital banking to payment systems, e-commerce, media. All these kind of things are growing significantly, and all these business are growing not only by foreign investors, but also with Vietnamese startup companies. So you can find a mix of everything here. Agriculture, this is one of the big sectors for Vietnam. Vietnam is one of the biggest exporters in the world for a number of agricultural commodities like rice, pepper, cashew nuts, coffee. I don't know if you're not familiar with it, but probably most of the coffee that you drink every day have some part that is coming from Vietnam. Basically, they have achieved this without significant technologies, management systems, processing systems. And now they are in a stage where they have realized they have to go one step ahead and develop that sector into a modern sector. And they need equipment, they need technologies, they need investment to move from small family-owned farms to industrial farms and business. And for that, the Vietnamese government has nominated the agriculture sector as one of the priorities to attract FDI. And again, the driver here is not only improving the efficiency and productivity of the sector, but also an increasing local demand for high quality products. That was something that they were not supplying in the past. Education, Vietnamese people are very aware of the need for high quality education. And basically, there is a gap between the demands of the market and what the public education can offer. So people, as long as they can afford it, they will be willing to pay for international education, and that goes to all kind of international education. That goes from international programs that are being taught here in Vietnam to sending students abroad. Last year there were like 5,000 students, Vietnamese students, that went to Canada. That's still a modest figure, considering that there is a total of 135,000 Vietnamese students. So again, there is room for Canada to do more work on this field. And as I say, it doesn't necessarily have to be attracting Vietnamese students to Canada. It can also be setting up educational institutions here on the ground. Foreign companies can do it on their own. They don't need local partners. It's a sector which is open. So Canadian education institutions can set up here on their own. They can do it with partners. They can do programs with universities. There is a big demand for English language, and this demand is growing. And I give you an example. One of the most successful private universities in the country is called RMIT. That's the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Obviously, that's from Australia. And they have been very, very, very successful, despite the fact that they are not really cheap and they're catering probably the high end of the market. But there is still a big demand, and now recently they are opening a new campus in Hanoi, so now they already have two campuses in the country. Another sector, oil and gas. Vietnam is a country with significant oil and gas reserves. Basically, what is happening is that the oil fields production rate are starting to decline, so there is a priority for the Vietnamese government to continue exploration and replace this production. And the other part is downstream. In terms of refining, there is only one refinery in the country. Most of the Vietnamese products are exported as crude oil, mainly to places like Singapore, where it's refined and sent back to the country as refined products. So obviously the added value is staying outside the country. So it's also a priority for Vietnam government to develop the downstream industry of oil industry. And there are already in place several projects to build at least 3 or 4 additional refineries. I have to say that I don't think they're going to happen as they're planned in time, but I think they eventually will happen. Typically, the way things work in Vietnam is that government plans take longer than they normally plan, but eventually they happen. So there are opportunities, as I say, downstream and also in the oil and service sector, not necessarily exploration or exploitation. How is it to do business in Vietnam? I think this is an interesting slide. Basically, doing business in Vietnam could be something similar to China. I would say the big difference between doing business in Vietnam and doing business in a Western country is basically in a Western country you can do anything except for what is forbidden. In Vietnam, you cannot do anything except for what you are specifically allowed to do. So that's a different approach to doing business. Having said that, once you are allowed to do your business, which is not something terribly complicated, the way companies operate, how difficult it is, I can give you 2 or 3 examples of that, and what does actually mean this ease of doing business. For example, we work with a company. It was an automotive components manufacturer who was setting up a factory in Vietnam. This was a $35 million investment where they were building a factory to supply components mainly to Korea and Japan. We did all the site selection and we did negotiation for the land acquisition, and we also helped them with the actual setup of the company. It took us 2 months to get all the permits to get the company up and running, which is, I would say, is pretty fast. We didn't have absolutely any problem. Another example, we did a transaction where one of our clients was acquiring industrial real estate from another private company. That took us something like 1.5 years, because what typically would be a two-party deal, it ended up becoming a four-party deal where we have the buyer, the seller, the bank, and the government. So you need to get the agreement of not two parties but four parties. Many of the things that were done during the process, you need permissions from the government. As I said before, it's not that you can do anything, you only can do what you are allowed to do. So in all the steps you need to get the permissions and the approvals from the government, and it's quite typical that they don't even know how to do it, especially when you come up with something new for them. They wouldn't know how to do it, and sometimes it takes quite a lot of time to get answers, but eventually it was done. I also want to give a negative example. I mentioned in some of the slides before, I put in there the name of some of the companies operating in Vietnam, and some of you might have noticed a company called Besra. That's a Canadian mining company who has been operating 2 gold mines in Vietnam for several years. They got into big trouble with Vietnam tax department, basically because the Vietnamese authorities, they changed the rules of the game, and they changed the way they calculated the royalties for minerals and natural resources, which resulted in big, significant tax liabilities, which put them into a lot of trouble. These kind of things also can happen, so you have to be aware that not everything is easy and straightforward. But on the other hand, as I said before, it's not impossible. Vietnam is not Singapore, Malaysia, or Thailand. It's definitely more difficult, but I would say it's in the middle pack of Asian countries, and many companies are very familiar doing business with China, and I'd say Vietnam is not very different to China. In terms of where Vietnam is going, ease of doing business and the business environment has been improving over the years, and that's the way it's going to continue going. And in terms of the size of the economy, if you see the bubbles in that chart, given the natural resources, the size of the country and the population, Vietnam should be somewhere more closer to what you see there in Thailand or Malaysia. So there is a lot of room for growth. And all Vietnamese growth is very much export dependent. The good thing about this is that all the Vietnamese exports are very dependent on imports. They need to buy most of the materials, most of the inputs. And that's where there are opportunities for many companies, supplying equipment, machinery, inputs. So Vietnamese future growth is going to be linked to future imports. Some specific sectors and drivers, I already talked a little bit about those. Basically increasing disposable income, which is creating demand for all kinds of products and services. From business to consumer standpoint, I put in there some of the sectors that are really moving fast, like fast-moving consumer goods, food and beverage, pharmaceutical, medical, and education services. From a business-to-business standpoint, I think the key driver is that the supporting industries are very weak, and as a result, all the export manufacturing that is taking place is really dependent on imports. So there are opportunities for supplying raw materials, equipment, and technology. This is from a selling standpoint. For companies who might be interested in investing in the country, again related to some of the sectors that I mentioned before, low-cost, labor-intensive manufacturing is one of the hottest things that is going on. In the past, it was pretty much garments and footwear. Now that's already changing, and we're starting to see quite a lot of electronics manufacturing. Most of the components are still imported, but for example, some of these big investors like Samsung, they are already attracting their supply chain. So we're starting to see many small and medium enterprise from Korea and Japan who are setting up here to supply the big producers. So that's something that's already happening. For domestic oriented market, again, the driver is the demand. I can give you some examples of industries that are doing, companies that are doing pretty well. For example, for the agro-business, Cargill is a big multinational company. Probably most of you are familiar with it. They have like 9 feed mills. Another company in the same sector, the House, is a Dutch company. They already have also like 8 feed mills. Recently we worked with an Irish pharmaceutical, actually veterinary products. We identify importers for them, and after one visit they already engage a company as a distributor, and within 3 months they are already selling products. So there is a demand for a wide range of products and services. And just to finalize, here I'm just going to talk about not everything. I would say strengths, political and social stability, young population, and increasing income. Opportunities, I think the big opportunity is the economic integration that is taking place both within Asia and between Vietnam and other regions of the world like Australia, Japan, European Union. Weakness, probably the biggest weakness is the lack of transparency. There are some cases of corruption also, and in terms of threats, I think the biggest threat for Vietnam to continue developing is the middle income trap. As they keep developing, they're going to become a more expensive place where to do business, and some of their advantages are gonna fade. The question is whether they're going to be able to move on the value chain to keep on growing on the basis of more added value, or more less commodity and labor intensive activities. So I think that's my presentation for today, and if anybody want to ask any question, I think there is a window somewhere on your screen where you can type, and I will be happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonio. Josh here in Singapore again. Very much appreciate your thoughts on Vietnam. Just want to clarify for anyone listening in, it should be a question panel on the GoToWebinar application. We would welcome any questions that you might have. And Antonio, I'll tee those up for you and feed those to you as they come in. There was a question earlier in the presentation about some of the cost of acquiring business licenses. This question in particular was about the cost of acquiring a business license for education. Now, I'm not sure that you would know that offhand, but would welcome any commentary that you might have about some of the cost of acquiring investment approvals or business licenses. And then perhaps a little bit to answer the second part of this individual's question, a little bit about some of the general practical day-to-day items around doing business in Vietnam. Things like what is required to get a multiple entry visa, how much is a visa, and and related to the first question on the cost of getting a business license, what type of tax and non-tax incentives are available for foreign investors considering Vietnam as a market?
Oh, that's not one question. And there are many questions. Okay, I'm going to try to address them all. In terms of how much does it cost to get an education license, to be honest, I don't know. Typically getting the business license, that does not really cost a lot of money. You don't really have to pay a lot of money. Vietnam regulations do not have a minimum requirement for capital investment. Okay, so the actual administrative procedures of getting your license and your documents and all that, you're really talking about, I don't know, hundreds of dollars, not even over $1,000. That's including all the translations and notaries and all that kind of stuff. So that's not a big issue. Again, they do not require capital investment by law. In practical terms, what really happens is that when you present a project, basically you need to get first what they call an investment license, which basically is a permit to allow you to invest in the country. And then you need to get a company registration, which is basically the process where you are setting up a legal entity. When you're doing that, though, there is not a capital investment, a minimum requirement for capital investment. What companies have to do, they have to present a plan which describes what they're going to do, how much they're going to invest, what kind of technologies they're going to do, or what kind of products and service they're going to provide. And sometimes the government and the authorities, and I cannot say how much because it really depends on the area of activity and also depends on the location. That means that what you are being asked in Ho Chi Minh City might not necessarily be the same as what you are being asked in Hanoi. They will suggest sometimes some kind of minimum capital, and basically what they want is to ensure that the companies that want to invest in the country have enough resources to actually execute the projects. That's what is behind it. But in terms of how much you have to pay, I don't think you really have to pay for an education license. What you have to go is through an approval process. Education is one of the sectors which is permitted, but is subject to evaluation. So that means that you need to present a project and explain what are the benefits you're going to bring and what is the business you're going to do. But I have to say that there are more than 200 education projects, foreign invested companies. So I don't think it's a big issue to get a permit for that. What are the other questions? Let me see.
So there's a question here, Antonio, from a member of the audience about the major trade shows and events, ones that you think that might be relevant to Canadian companies, anything that you might be aware of that's coming up in 2017, and how you think foreign companies, Western companies, in particular Canadian companies, can benefit from these types of programs, or if you think there's a different approach that they maybe should take.
Well, there are many trade shows. I don't know them all for the top of my head. They are really typically they are sector specific. I would say that based on my experience, trade shows, except for things like consumer products or food stuff, they are not really used by companies to enter the market. They are more used for companies that are already doing some kind of business. They have an agent or a representative, so they are using to showcase the products or service that are already available in the market rather than for finding new clients. So I see many industrial companies that do that, and typically it's the distributors who actually set up the booths and participate, and then there's a good opportunity for the foreign supplier to come in and support their partners in the country. It also works for reaching the public, but that's more for consumer goods and food. I cannot say which ones are good for Canadian companies. This is really sector specific. If someone has a specific interest, I will be happy to get some of the key names and I share that with you.
Sure, and I think if you switch to the next slide, Antonio, I think all your contact particulars are there, and I'm also sure that if there are specific questions that we're unable to answer off the top of our heads, that you're happy to follow that up by email and have a chat.
Yeah, I think there was another question about visa, long-term visas. Again, I'm not sure whether the Vietnamese issue 1 year multiple entry visas. They used to do that in the past. They changed it and they limit it to 6 months multiple entry. I think that costs like $100 or something like that in the Canadian Vietnamese embassies in abroad. The issue is not something terribly complicated, and in fact, the Vietnamese government is currently discussing to put in place a program where visitors can apply for visa online, which is something that they do not have yet. They have removed the visa requirements for tourists for many countries, mostly European countries. So visitors below 15 days, they don't even need a visa to come to Vietnam. Business visitors that plan to stay longer, they need a visa, but again, it's not complicated.
Thanks, Antonio. There's so this is a technical term, I guess, but a hand raised in the GoToWebinar application from a colleague, it looks like from Ernst & Young. I'm going to make an effort to unmute that individual and let them ask their question if they'd like. Apologies in advance if we face technical trouble. The question is from Hung Tran. Do you have a specific question you wanted to voice for the group? Perhaps just technical inaccuracy. Antonio, a question that I have for you is around risk, compliance, and corruption. Canadian companies globally have an excellent, sterling reputation, really, for adherence to best practice around the gold standard of doing business, business ethics, and have are governed by very strict anti-corruption practice legislation. Vietnam can be a challenging market to do business in that respect. Hoping you could outline some of the risks of doing business in Vietnam for Canadian businesses, specifically as they relate to corruption and compliance issues, and anything else that you think might be particularly unique to Canadian companies operating in Vietnam.
Well, I'm going to start with the risk and how is it to operate here. I think the biggest difference is transparency. The business framework is not always black and white in Vietnam. There are a lot of gray areas, and Canadian companies planning to operate here have to learn to live with that. And sometimes these gray areas means that when you deal with the administration, they don't even know how to implement or apply the regulations. Typically, laws are passed by the National Assembly on a country level, and they are passed for implementation to the provincial level. What happens is sometimes there is sometimes significant difference between the time where the laws are approved and come into place and the time where the Vietnamese administration actually receive instructions on how these laws are to be implemented. Vietnamese legislative system can be quite complicated. They have laws, and then they have decrees, and then they have decisions, and then they have explanations. So they have different levels of laws and regulations. So it's not all the time straightforward, and sometimes that's complicated. And as I say, the Vietnamese administration, sometimes they don't even know how to apply it. So you can imagine that a company would find it like even more difficult. So companies have to learn to deal with that. That basically means that the rhythm of business is going to be much slower than what companies might be used to, and things take much longer to happen. So eventually they happen, but it takes longer. With regards to the risk and issues with corruption, we do work a lot with American companies, and American companies are always very concerned about corruption issues. And typically our clients are multinational companies, and for them abiding by FCPA is a must. So corruption in Vietnam is common. There are several levels of corruption. The low level of corruption, that means dealing with the public servant who have to stamp some of your documents and process your taxes and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's really a big issue for doing business in Vietnam. The way we have dealt with it on the past is basically make the Vietnamese people to understand that American companies cannot operate under that scheme. That might be common for Korean or Chinese or Taiwanese companies, but that's not the case for the Americans. And eventually they do understand. typically what would happen is that if you play the game, maybe, not always, they will speed up process. If you don't do it, maybe they will try to delay it, but eventually they will understand it. And what we have experienced is that typically they will not ask us for money because, I mean, some of the government officers, they are very familiar with foreign investment. I mean, they are seeing dozens of investment projects every month from Japan, from the US, from Europe. So the government officers, they do know about it, and they typically will not ask for payments. That's for general operation. Having said that, I have to say that there are certain sectors which are more prone to corruption, and these are specifically real estate, government procurement, and in dealing with, not necessarily directly with the government, because the government has very strict bidding regulations where any procurement from the government have to go through tenders and have so it's more dealing with state-owned companies. So these are companies that are owned by the government, but that they are managed somehow like a private company. So that's more complicated. And the other area is I think I say real estate, anything that has to do with the land, basically, because the land it belongs to the people, but the management and the decisions on how the land is used, it basically belongs to a very limited number of government officials in each province. So real estate, government or state-owned companies procurement, and the other one is natural resources. Anything related to mining, and again related to land. That are the areas where we see more cases of corruption. The other thing is that companies, and we have seen cases of this, companies that do not want to get involved into this, if things escalate and they don't get things solved, companies can bring these issues up to higher levels of the government. And believe me that lower level government officials don't want to be pointed as people asking for bribes and paybacks. And they don't want to be scrutinized by their bosses on the higher levels, because Vietnamese, they are aware that this is an important issue for foreign investors.
Thank you, Antonio. There's another question here about distributors. One of the audience members is interested in identifying and papering an agreement with the distributor for Vietnam. The question is about what the technical requirements are in terms of the paperwork, what's required to set up a joint venture, or rather a distributor agreement in Vietnam. But I would welcome your comments as well in terms of the importance of sort of taking a methodological approach to searching for and selecting a distributor. Could you comment on some of your experience running that kind of work in Vietnam?
Yes. First, with regards to setting up a joint venture, I already described a little bit how is it to set up.
Sorry, Antonio. I do believe it's a distributor arrangement rather than a joint venture, but we'll leave it to respond.
There is no, basically there is no specific requirement for a distributor arrangement. There's a private deal between two companies, but depending on the type of products that your distributor is going to be selling, they might require some registration. Basically, this is not applicable for all the products, only for certain products. And I can share, if you send me your questions, I can tell you whether your products would fall under this category. Some products require a specific import license, and this is one of the challenging issues that we have been trying to deal with in the past, where basically your distributor have the exclusive rights to import your products. So you need to go through an approval process where your products are approved to be sold in the Vietnamese market. This is very typical for example, pharmaceutical products, fertilizers, food products. That are typical cases. If you're going to be selling tables or furniture, probably you don't need any registration, and you just don't have a deal with an importer. So one of the problems with this is that when you give these import exclusive rights to the distributor, it can be problematic because you might have an agreement and after 1 year it doesn't work. Sometimes it can be a problem for an exporter to change distributor because you already have one who have a license. So that's one of the areas where it's sometimes complicated and companies really have to do their homework. And I'm not meaning that it cannot be done. I'm just saying that it can be complicated and companies have to do their homework. In terms of how to find for distributors, we do a lot of work for the U.S. Commercial Service where they help American companies to find distributors and importers in all kinds of products, pharmaceuticals, veterinary, testing equipment, water equipment, you name it. And typically what happens is that we always find somebody interested. So that's telling us that there's a lack of Western technologies. The way we approach it is we deal with companies. Typically we follow a methodology where we try to define what are the critical requirements for a distributor to have. That can be things like revenue, size of the company, number of sales points, number of foreign clients they work with. That really depends, and what we try to do is identify what are the companies who meet these criteria and eliminate the ones that do not meet. And then once we have a short list of potential companies, typically what we will do is set up meetings with the exporter, and at the end of the day, once you have identified the companies that meet the criteria and have an interest in your product, that obviously, I mean, Vietnam is also a competitive market. You have to compete with suppliers from other places. It's up to the companies to make a deal. I give an example before about this Irish veterinary products company. We did identify a number of distributors, and within 2 months they already have an agreement and they were sending products.
Antonio, is there anything that we did not ask as a group this evening, this morning, that you think we should have asked, or any closing comments you want to share with us before we end the program today?
I think my final remark would be that Vietnam is the new, I would say, new kid on the block. Is the new star in Southeast Asia. Vietnam was not in the first wave of foreign investment and opening to business as countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, or Thailand were in the early 90s. They are a latecomer, but I have to say that they are catching up very fast. And the prospects of the country are continuous growth. That's what everybody is expecting because of the demographics and the way the government is managing things. They are doing things pretty well. So I think this is not something that we're talking about a one-time opportunity. This is something that's going to continue.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you to all of our audience who have called in this morning or this evening, for anyone calling in Asia. We greatly appreciate your kind attention and your interest in the subject matter. Antonio's contact particulars are here. You're welcome to reach out to me, Joshua Brown, at our Singapore office, or to reach out to Antonio directly. If you're not already aware, let me remind you that we'll be continuing to host these programs over the next 4 days. Tomorrow at 4 p.m. Singapore time and 11 a.m. EST, Eastern Standard Time, we'll be presenting on Thailand. On Wednesday, we'll be presenting on Indonesia. On Thursday, we'll be presenting on Myanmar. And on Friday, I'll be presenting on Singapore. So if any of those markets are of additional interest and you'd like to participate in the program, please feel free to register. And if you don't have access to the registration links, please feel free to reach out for that information. Once again, thank you very much for joining in on the program. I hope you got some benefit and value out of it, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.